Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, bienvenidos. For those of you who want to continue in English, please stay put. And las personas que desean escuchar la versión en español, por favor, elegir el idioma oprimiendo el botón en forma de círculo donde dice español en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Gracias. So good afternoon to all of our live attendees today. We are thrilled you're here to engage in this important webinar, Creating Trauma-Sensitive, Safe, and Supportive School Cultures for All Students. I'm Dr. Tiffany O'Shaughnessy, and I'm one of the hosts of our webinar today. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a white cisgender woman in my early 40s with an undercut buzzed hair on the left side of my and chin-length purple hair on my right side. I'm wearing a black top, and my background is an office with a fiddle leaf fig, a beige couch, and a blue floral painting. I'm a professor and the MFT program coordinator in the Department of Counseling here at San Francisco State University. I'm one of the co-investigators for this project. I'm working alongside the project's primary investigator, Dr. Molly Streer, who's the coordinator of our school counseling program, and my co-investigator, Dr. Julie Cronister, who is our department chair. I'd like to acknowledge that SF State's campuses in San Francisco sit on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone. We further acknowledge that we work on the ancestral lands and waters of many other Indigenous peoples and nations in our field work in the Bay Area and around the world. We also acknowledge the enslaved peoples, primarily of African descent, whose labor built many of the facilities that we gather in and those of the United States. To move this statement from acknowledgement to action, we encourage you to learn more about the Ohlone people and to lend your time, talent, and other resources and service in whatever ways you deem right and true for you. We are committed to ensuring this webinar is accessible to our audiences. Closed captioning is available in the closed captioning option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If at any time your access needs are not met or become not met during the webinar, please send a chat directly to a host or co-host. Access is always a work in progress, so we appreciate your comments, feedback, and support. This is our annual training sponsored by our school-based mental health counseling training project, which is fully funded by the Department of Education. The contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of nor endorsement by the Department of Education or the U.S. government. A few additional things before we begin. If you are interested in receiving continuing education credit for your live attendance today, please pay close attention to the announcements provided in the chat for sign-in and evaluation links. As a reminder, this is a live recorded Zoom webinar, therefore the audience is not visible and you can't turn on your video or your audio. But the chat function is available for comments, sharing of resources, supportive emojis, etc. If you have a specific question for the presenter that you'd like to ask, we will have time at the end. So please post your question in the Q&A function, and we'll try to have Q&A for the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. So post your questions as they emerge, and the presenter will answer questions. If we can't get to them all, you can contact the presenter directly, and their information will be posted in the chat. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's presenter, Marissa T. Del Rosario, LICSW. Ms. Del Rosario is a trauma-sensitive school specialist with the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, TLPI, a program of Harvard Law School's Youth Advocacy and Policy Lab, the Y-Lab. In this role, she supports TLPI's work with educators in creating trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive schools, and participates in TLPI's innovative Student Speak initiative, supporting young people to raise their voice in educational decision-making. Prior to joining TLPI, Marissa worked in urban and rural school districts as both an educator and as a licensed clinical social worker. She has expertise in working with students, families, and school personnel at all levels to help remove barriers to student educational success. I am so looking forward to learning more from her about this work and the ways that we can build safer and more supportive school cultures. But first, I'm going to turn this over to the director of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, Ann Eisner, who will provide a brief introduction to the important work that they're doing. Ann, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Tiffany said, my name is Ann Eisner. I'm the director of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. My colleague Marissa and I are thrilled to be here with you all this afternoon and to share our work with you. Before we start, I would like to provide some context for the work, how it came about, and where it has taken us. TLPI is a multidisciplinary project comprised of social workers, a school psychologist, and a special education attorney who is also a former educator. Our work began in the mid-90s. It was led by TLPI's founder, the late Susan Cole, a former special education teacher for many years, who then became an attorney, a special education attorney. And the reason that she gives for having made that career switch is to get her students out of the basement and have them join their peers so that they could feel that they belong to the school just the way the other students felt. So when the work began, the power in Massachusetts, the power to expel students and suspend students had been taken away from the school committees and placed in the hands of the principals. And that resulted in a large influx of calls to the helpline at the nonprofit where Susan Cole was employed, providing legal services to students with learning differences. As she responded, providing legal services to have the children remain in school, she was curious to understand what was happening, what had led to students becoming identified as problems in schools to the point where they were being pushed out. And just as we all learned from our practice, she had one case representing a young man in an urban school district who had been referred by her to a neuropsychologist in order to understand what were his needs underlying his learning differences. And this happened to be a neuropsychologist who had come to understand PTSD. And she helped Susan identify that that was what was happening with the student that she was representing. And so Susan's understanding began. She was able to engage in years-long collective inquiry with other professionals in the Boston area. And she started by convening several multidisciplinary work groups, including some family attorneys who were representing victims of domestic violence, some neuropsychologists, who, again, as we were saying, were beginning to understand the impact of trauma on individuals, and as well as some school social workers and school psychologists. So what they found as they started their inquiry was that there was a lot of information about the impact of trauma on individuals, but very little about how trauma might impact a child and what that would look like at school. So she, in this important research that they created, that they were so deeply engaged in, they were able to come to understand how school culture, including discipline systems and the way that schools think about and observe student behavior, could either exacerbate or mitigate the impacts of trauma on students. What they began to understand was that for those students who had been exposed to childhood adversity, not just in their home, but also in their community or in some of the countries that they might have been fleeing, those were students who needed to feel connected, needed to have strong relationships and positive relationships with adults and peers, needed to be bolstered as they learned ways to manage their behavioral and their emotional and their attentional needs. And when that happens, when educators can look at what a child needs through the whole child lens and they begin to see the whole child and all of the things that are happening in their lives, it enables them to respond appropriately and enables those students to begin to feel that they have a sense of belonging and that they are connected to the school community because they're experiencing these positive relationships with adults. In order to have schools be able to do that, Susan and her colleagues came to understand that mindsets in schools needed to shift toward visioning school as a safe place, a safe haven for students with warm, caring adults. And this was a really important understanding to be able to bring to teachers. And so that work that they initially did is encapsulated in the Purple Book. We're going to be hearing a lot about the learning from the Purple Book this evening as Marissa talks. Was published in 2005, so we just celebrated its 20th year in print. And then the Teal Book that you'll also hear about with Marissa this evening describes in more detail how schools can become those safe and supportive, trauma-sensitive environments for students. Our theory of change here at our project is that if we can establish schools that can meet the needs of this vulnerable group of students, students who've experienced diversity, then we know it can meet the needs of all students. So we want to sort of share with you that this is not about screening for trauma. It's more about building a whole school approach that can support all students. When educators can develop this understanding of trauma and begin to examine what is working and what is not working in their schools through the trauma-sensitive lens, they can articulate a clearer understanding about why certain initiatives and approaches are working and why others are not. And so this is not about, it's not the goal to be taking on new initiatives. It's the goal is to understand what you already have in place in schools that is really helping students feel connected, and how you move away from those practices that may be disconnecting students. And so the important piece here is that creating a safe and supportive trauma-sensitive school is going to be supportive for each and every student, not just for those students who have experienced trauma. So to that end, just to sort of wrap up and share with you a little bit more about our work, TLPI has also worked to instantiate in policy in Massachusetts a way to support schools to become more safe and supportive. We built a multidisciplinary coalition to help us advocate for a law that was passed in 2014. It's our State Safe and Supportive Schools Framework Statute. So that was over 10 years ago, and that law provides a grant program for schools that want to engage in this work in order to move toward becoming more safe and supportive. It also set in place a commission that oversees this work across the state. And to date, over 130 districts have engaged in having a grant to see their work to become safe and supportive. So we invite you to join us today to learn more about the trauma-sensitive lens, and invite you to use that lens as you reflect and engage in collective inquiry with others in your school, and to try to understand how your school cultures might transform through trauma sensitivity toward becoming more safe and supportive for all students. And again, we welcome you, and I want to turn this over to Marissa now, who's going to share a lot more detail with you this evening about our work.
Thank you so much, Anne, and to Tiffany as well for the wonderful introduction and for the framing of this afternoon's conversation. I'm thrilled to be a part of this webinar and to share with you the work that we've done to support schools to create trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive school cultures for all students. I just want to state a few things from the outset. One is that we welcome your comments in the chat. Webinars are difficult to make engaging and didactic, and so conversational. So we just welcome you to ask questions, comments in the chat, anything like that. Secondly, I just want to sort of preface this by saying that we are talking about trauma and adverse experiences that young people may encounter. And so for some of us, that can bring up things that we may have encountered in our own life experience. And so I just also invite you to take good care of yourselves throughout. If at any point the content becomes a bit difficult, I just invite you to take good care of yourself through that. So with that, I want to just get started with sharing a little bit about what we're hoping to accomplish this afternoon in the webinar. These were the learning objectives that were shared as you signed up. We want to share with you information about how engaging in a process of collective inquiry and reflection can lead educators to shifts in thinking and in practice that result in trauma-sensitive, anti-racist school culture change. We want to share with you what the attributes of a trauma-sensitive school are. And we want to talk with you a little bit about where that gets you and sort of what the research says about creating this kind of school culture. And lastly, just talking about how we think about how to best incorporate inclusive school-based decision-making practices that promote safe and supportive school cultures. Anne talked a little bit about our mission, but I just want to center this in this conversation, just this idea that what our project is all about, our mission is to really ensure that all students including those who have been impacted by trauma, succeed at their highest levels in school and in life. And for us, it's just really important to keep top of mind that we define trauma not only as those harms that stem from individual adverse experience in a young person's life, but also from the harms that extend from structural inequities like racism, gender bias, those kinds of things. What you see on the slide below is just a little bit of a roadmap of how our project works. As Anne described, we have the joy of working with schools to support them to create these kinds of environments, these kinds of learning environments. And from that, we learn a lot from educators, teachers, principals, district leaders, what it's like, what's sort of in place that supports this work, and then also the barriers that they encounter along the way. We also have because we're housed at a law school, we have a special education clinic, an individual representation clinic, as Anne described, where our student attorneys work with students and families who are navigating the special education system. And from that, we learn so much about what that is like for a young person, for a family. And so the parent voice sort of informs our work as well. And as Anne described so well, we do our best to lift those voices to the policy level to try to create systemic change that supports the creation of trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive schools. So that's a little bit more about TLPI. And before I share with you just an overview of sort of how the presentation will flow, I'll share a little bit more with you about my background, which is as both an educator and a school social worker. And so I bring sort of with me the experience of working with young people over the last many, many years to help them achieve success in school and to come to better understand and learn from them about what they need in order to do well in school. And so throughout the presentation, as I share information, I'm also often reminded of my students and of their families and of the communities that I've worked in. So you may hear some anecdotes about that as well. So in terms of the time that we'll spend together this afternoon, we want to just begin with a focus on school culture and why positive school culture is important. And more than positive school culture, why that school culture must be trauma sensitive, safe, and supportive. And so we'll sort of lay some groundwork by having a conversation about that. We want to really then begin to fill in what it looks like, sounds like, feels like to be in a trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive school culture. So we're going to show or demonstrate some of that through some video and through some conversation. And then lastly, just a pathway or a how-to. We will share with you the inquiry-based process that TLPI has piloted and worked with many schools with over the years to help support them to create these kinds of school cultures. So to begin, I thought maybe we could just invite you to reflect a little bit on your own experience in a learning environment. And for this exercise, if you could just spend a few minutes thinking a bit about a time when you felt truly safe and supported in a learning environment. And that could be a formal setting like a classroom or a school, or it could be, a mentoring relationship you've maybe encountered, or any other setting where you feel like you were really supported to learn something new and learn it well and be engaged in the content in a way that helped you thrive as a learner. And so as you think about that, try to call to mind what the adult did or the mentor did that made the experience successful for you. And I just invite you to share in the chat words or phrases that come to mind when you think of those adults and what they did to make those experiences successful. So I'm going to give just a couple of minutes for that. I see a warm and friendly teacher. I think of sort of positive relationships when I think about learning environments that helped me be successful. conveying caring and warmth. You felt acknowledged, respected, encouraged. Yes. Educators who created an environment where there was no quote unquote right answer, right? That there was space to provide your opinions, your ideas, non-judgmental space, calm space. So these are great. This really helps us sort of surface what students need in order to feel safe and supported to learn. So what I want to do next is sort of talk a little bit about understanding how school culture can strengthen these qualities that you're mentioning in the chat, or undermine it in terms of those conditions. There's another comment: allowed me to ask questions, encouraged me to speak my mind, made sure I had access to food. Educators who made themselves available in terms of time, whether in person or virtually. So all of these ways in which the adults really set the conditions for you to feel safe and supported. And so while this is so important in the individual student relationship, let's see how we can translate that into the school culture. How these kinds of qualities, these kinds of ways of being with students can be embedded in the way our school operates. So this is a slide that talks a little bit about what school culture is. I'm sure if I ask that question, we could all come up with sort of our own version of that answer. This is from a book called School Culture Rewired, and these are sort of the ways that school culture is described in the book. It's sort of how we work together, the way we share understanding across our building and sort of operate from that understanding. It's the teamwork and the collaboration that exists in the building. It's the sense of how we do or do not solve problems together. It's those unwritten rules, the things that are just understood, sort of about, this is the way we do things around here. Another word for it is sort of our ecology, our environment. It's the norms and values that drive sort of what happens behind the scenes. So these are all different ways that school culture can be defined or described. We had the opportunity to do some focus groups with educators across Massachusetts a few years ago, and we were asking about, what is it that makes a school culture feel safe and supportive, or how do you define a school culture that is safe and supportive? And so what you see here on the slides are just a few quotes from those educators, teachers who said, I think you feel it. Right? When you walk in the building, I think you feel it. It's the vibe, it's the feel that things are running smoothly, it's friendly, it's warm, it's welcoming. Another educator said, school culture is about when what you as the school value is clearly seen to anyone who walks in the building. So it's like our lived, expressed values are on display for anyone who comes in. Another educator said school culture is also the unwritten rules about how things operate behind the scenes. How do we talk about our students behind closed doors? How do we approach certain problems? So these are just a few different ideas that educators shared with us about the way they define school culture. The last quote there always reminds me of when I was a brand new teacher. One of our veteran teachers sort of pulled me aside one day and cautioned me about eating my lunch in our school faculty lounge too often. I was in a very challenging elementary school, and certain times of the year when people got pretty fatigued, the conversations in that faculty lounge could be very negative. And she was really standing up for me and challenging me, not to kind of buy into that, but also protecting me from sort of the burnout that can show up in spaces like that at times. The other thing that we did in this work as we were learning about safe and supportive school culture was to really engage with young people and ask them what their view of a safe and supportive, trauma-sensitive school culture is. And so these are just a couple of quotes from the focus groups that we did with young people. One young person said, our school, it just feels friendly. Teachers will be communicating with one another, laughing. It feels fun, exciting. You're having fun. You're not really worried about feeling nervous or shy. You just feel comfortable. And so this young person, I think this description just really gets at it, right? It's that you feel settled and comfortable in this environment. I have the ability to be open to learn. Another young person also spoke to sort of feeling calm, feeling relaxing, feeling friendly. The teacher, you can trust her and stuff to ask questions, to learn things, because it actually gives you time to get your mind thinking, right? So someone spoke to this in the chat, just the time, like allowing you the space and the time to kind of answer when you're ready, when you have something to say, when you're willing to share. I think the other thing that this quote gets to is just the importance of relationship and trust among educators and young people. And so what I wanted to just kind of note about sharing the student voice piece is, that our young people are paying attention. They feel it, they know it. And we can engage with them in creating these kinds of school cultures because they have a vision for what it is and they experience it, right? And so sort of tapping into their lived experience of school. What is it like for them? How can it be better? What can we do as adults that help make them feel more safe and supportive? Something we'll talk much more about later in the presentation, but this quote just reminded me of that. So I wanted to just share also a little bit about why, a positive school culture is so important. There's a lot of academic research that speaks to this, but at the core, the studies really show that students just learn best in a safe and supportive environment. So much is written about, the need for safety, the need for feeling settled and ready to learn. And so that's, really beneficial for the students and certainly what we want to strive to create. But I think equally important is that creating a positive or safe and supportive school culture in this way, it also allows educators to move from being reactive in circumstances to being very proactive. And so that's one of the mindset shifts that Anne was describing earlier that has to happen and that often results as educators engage in this process to become more safe and supportive. So just underscoring this need to move from being reactive to proactive. So we've talked a lot about why it's important to have, a positive school culture. But I want to underscore, why must that culture be trauma sensitive, safe and supportive? Why is that so important? And so we're going to move into talking a little bit more about trauma and its impacts and the prevalence of trauma as one of the main reasons why this is so important. But just to, at the outset, to sort of state that a huge part of this is really helping everyone in the school building share an understanding of how trauma can impact learning, behavior, and relationships. Because when we can create that shared understanding, it helps us see the whole child. It helps us better understand why the student may be acting in very unexpected ways. And so we think of this understanding as a pathway to creating safe and supportive school culture. So to underscore and to sort of take a moment to just highlight why a school culture must be trauma sensitive, safe, and supportive, I wanted to just share with you our thinking and our learning about just the ubiquitous nature of trauma, starting with just the prevalence of trauma. So what you see on this slide may look very familiar to many of you. For some of you, it may be new, but this is the data from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. That was sort of one of the studies that sort of launched the field from back in 1998, where we really came to understand in a population of the 17,000 sort of white middle class folks who were in the cohort in the study, how prevalent these individual adverse childhood experiences were. And so what you see there are just the rates of adverse childhood experiences across about 10 different categories. And so this study, has been replicated over and over again through the years since the late 90s as the field has grown. And so what I take from this is, what came kind of as a thing to underscore about the adverse childhood experiences study is that for all of those categories, 64% of that population reported at least one of those adverse childhood experiences in childhood. And so that, it's just a staggering number. And I think when we first learned this back in the late 90s, it was a staggering number. And it's still to this day, when I look at the slide, even though I show it often, it sort of gives me pause to think about how prevalent this is. I wanted to just highlight one of the studies that is sort of a replication of the ACE study that happened back in 2013, because one of the things that this study did was add in some of those systemic issues that I mentioned earlier. And so in addition to the individual adverse experiences, and you can see that the numbers sort of bear out similarly in this study, they added a few categories. Things like witnessing violence in my community, feeling discriminated against, and what they defined as adverse neighborhood, which included, things like poverty and crime rates and those kinds of things. So you can see that that number jumps to 83.2% of the population in this study reporting at least one of these adverse experiences as a young person. 83.2%. And so what we can think about now is that we have recently been through sort of a community-wide, right, traumatic experience, the COVID-19 pandemic, where, we saw students and families just being at increased risk of stress. There was a lot of loss. We observed disproportionate impacts, which exacerbated the existing gaps in learning and in supports for many families. So many students were disconnected from those warm, caring communities that gave them a sense of safety each day. Many families and students experienced just a reduction in their access to the supports that help them throughout. And so I think what we've seen in the literature and the research since the end of the pandemic, right, are these lingering effects. And so what we see is that, this need for a trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive culture is sort of more important than ever, just based on the prevalence, the number of people. We know that this is not an issue that can be solved one student by one student. Those individual supports and services that we provide to students in schools are so important, but the context in which those supports are happening it's also critically important. And so this sort of prevalence and ubiquitous nature just really point to the need for a whole school approach. So to underscore just a little bit more about why a school culture has to be safe and supportive, trauma sensitive, I just want to review briefly a little bit about the neurobiological impacts of trauma and what that really looks like at school in terms of a student's ability to learn and to, self-regulate their emotions and their behavior and to be in relationship with their peers and with the adults who work with them. So this slide is just sharing with you a little bit of information about trauma's impact on neurobiology. And so for many of you, again, this information may be familiar, and you may have ways that you share this information with educators as well. This is our way of sharing this information with educators. What we really want everyone to sort of be facile with and understand is that, of course, we're humans, we're mammals, we're wired to keep ourselves safe, right? Our neurobiology, we have a component that exists to keep us safe. And so when we don't feel safe, that sort of kicks in and takes over. And so that, fight, flight, fawn, freeze response in the limbic system can be triggered. But what we want educators to understand is that for some young people, based on their, just by bent of their life experience, that system has been aroused over and over again many times. And so what happens is students may come to school, sort of scanning for safety and on alert, and looking for the ways in which their environment at school communicates safety. And when they don't encounter that safety, unexpected things can happen. And so just by bent of a young person's experience, this may be, how they arrive in the morning of the door at the school day. This kind of chronic limbic stimulation can really lower the threshold for a trigger. And so I think often of students maybe, and especially students I've worked with over the years in school, where they arrive at school and, who knows what may have happened in the community or in the home as they're coming to school. But they get there, right? That's hurdle number one. They arrive at the door. And so they're making their way to class. And I think about, just the nature of the morning at school. Often in many schools I've worked in, I think we're getting better about this. But for many years, as I worked in schools, the hallway could be rather chaotic. Lots of people, lots of bodies, lots of noise, lockers opening and closing, people sort of in a rush because they know the bell is about to ring and we have to get started. So there's sort of this heightened energy as you enter the school. And so for a student maybe who has this lowered trigger threshold, they're already sort of sensing that, right? And sort of scanning. And so maybe they make their way to the classroom and the teacher may hand them a sheet of paper, something to do now to sort of get ready for the day, get ready for the lesson. And the student may take that paper, but on their way to the desk to sit down, perhaps maybe they bump into someone or someone bumps into them or someone drops something or they hear the air conditioner vent kick on. And so they're taking in all of this stimulus as they make their way to their seat. And so as they begin to try to look at that paper, as they've been taking in the stimulus, possibly time has passed, right? And the bell is getting closer and closer to ringing. So at best, maybe the student looks over at their neighbor and sort of sees what they're doing and might write down a thing or two on the sheet. You have a variety of responses, right? Maybe a student balls it up and throws it across the room or in the trash can. Maybe they just scribble their name across the top and turn it in as the bell rings. So what happens with that for that student as the teacher sits down to go through that pile of paper? And as a teacher, I certainly have encountered this, right? When you see that that piece of paper turned in that has a name scrawled across the top. What is it that we begin to think about that student? I wish that when I was in the classroom, I sort of had this knowledge because I didn't think, oh, maybe they were a little hypervigilant today and weren't able to settle and get anything done. I think what I thought often was, what were they doing? Were they wasting time? Were they not motivated? Were they, did they not understand the assignment, not capable of doing this? I had other thoughts and judgment about what might be going on with that student. So this chronic kind of limbic system stimulation can really result in that kind of hypervigilance that we see with many students coming into our school. And so as we can help educators understand that, the path to helping to support them to develop the skills they need to feel more regulated and ready for the school day begins. So we have insight into what to do. I'm going to share with you also just some of the other ways that this chronic limbic stimulation can impact a young person. It can alter utilization and connection and brain structures. It can reduce the size of certain brain structures and alter hormone and transmitter secretion. And so just a number of different kinds of impacts that can occur for a young person. I think the other thing I think about when I reflect on this information is the student who is sort of walking through the school day and kind of riding this roller coaster throughout the day, where maybe they have sort of peaks and valleys, right? And with some teachers or in some classrooms or with some adults, They're very settled and ready to go. And then maybe they leave that classroom and walk down the hallway and encounter, a different kind of learning environment, a different kind of setting in a classroom that doesn't feel as safe and supportive for them. And so we also often have students in our buildings who are sort of riding this roller coaster of being really stimulated and then settled and then really stimulated and then settled. And so their day can just be sort of a roller coaster. Often that can result in students sort of spending more time in their survival brain, with the limbic system activated rather than in their learning brain. And so where they're able to access the prefrontal cortex. And so, the work that we do to create trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive cultures is really to help support students to develop the skills that they need to self-regulate their behavior, attention, and emotions, so that they can really more consistently throughout the day sort of access that learning brain. So I want to just briefly review some of these impacts in the context of school. And again, I'll just say with respect to the audience, some of this may be very familiar to you, but this is our way of sharing with educators what these impacts might look like in the classroom. And so we just invite you to sort of see how we share this information. It's important, I think, for educators to understand that trauma can impact learning, behavior, and relationships, because those are three keys: learning, behavior, and relationships that helps students experience success at school. And so really, when you think about it, given the prevalence of traumatic experience and given that it can impact almost every aspect needed to be successful at school, it's really important that we all developed this understanding. So what you see on the slide here are just some of the potential impacts of trauma on learning. There can be impacts in terms of language. Both written and oral and nonverbal language can be impacted. I think of my elementary age students sometimes who just really struggled to convey fully what they were feeling or what they were thinking, or even a response to maybe a question I asked about a story I was reading aloud. Language can be greatly impacted. The ability just to process oral and written information, the ability to, sort of those executive functioning skills to sort of have sequential organization, memory, all of these can be impacted by trauma. Often in schools, we rely heavily in our delivery of how we deliver curriculum on executive function, right? This ability for students to develop sort of the goal, plan, do, review system, where, maybe there's an assignment and they set their goal about what they're going to do. They make the plan for how they're going to do it. They execute that plan. And if that plan works out, if the assignment goes well, they sort of store that away over time and they pull it out again the next time there's assignment, right? They review what worked, what didn't work. They might change it a little bit as a learner, and it sort of becomes embedded in the way that they approach assignments or approach tasks at school. This can be greatly impacted by trauma. In addition to that, helping educators understand the sort of critical nature of managing and planning transitions becomes very important for young people who have had traumatic experience. Those transitions can, again, sort of create that sense of dysregulation, right? What's happening? I need to know what's happening. What can I expect? The sort of knowing what to expect helps students sort of settle. But many students can really struggle. I think of a young man that I worked with for many years, but when he first came to us, one of our closing rituals of the classrooms of the school day is that just before the bell would ring, we would line up, the students would line up, but before they lined up, they would place their chair on top of their desk. And for this so you can imagine that in a classroom of 20 plus students, young students, just picking up the chair and putting it on top of the desk, it's noisy, it's a little bit chaotic, there's a lot of motion, chairs fall down. Not everybody gets it right the first time. And it could get really chaotic during that time. And this young man, just for days in a row, really struggled at dismissal. And I never really put that together until I realized one day that we forgot to put the chairs on top of the table. Part of that ritual was to help the custodian, right? We were trying to get the room ready to help the custodian out. But what I realized on the day that we forgot to do it is that this young person was able to line up, no problem. He was very settled, bag was packed, ready to go. And so, kind of reflecting on that, I thought, I wonder if it's all the noise and chaos. And you may be sitting there thinking, yes, of course, it's the noise and chaos. But when you have a ritual and it's the way we do things around here, sometimes we don't sort of hit the pause button and think a little bit more deeply about it, especially if it's not working for everyone. So I just share that as an example of kind of how some of these things can manifest in the classroom, and that this ability to tend to transitions can be a very important component in setting students up to do well, all students up to do well. And of course, the other impact that's related to learning can be on attention, just the ability to really attend to tasks, attend to sort of what's going on in the moment. Given the example of the student that I talked about who may be coming in sort of in that hyper aroused state, it's not necessarily that they're not paying attention, right? Their attention is in a lot of places. It's in the sound of the air conditioner. It's in, whether or not the person across the table is looking at me in a way that conveys anger. It's whether or not the teacher's tone of voice signals something to me. So the attention is in many places. It's not that there isn't attention. The attention just isn't, on the worksheet or on sort of the task at hand. And so again, this can impact learning. What you see on this slide are some of the potential impacts of trauma on behavior. And I think when many discussions about the impact of trauma happen at school, we often talk about behavior. And so, of course, it's the students who may display aggression or defiance. I think we talk a lot about that at schools. And often at school, that can be really, really difficult to manage. It can be the students who withdraw. It can also be the students who want to get everything right? If I just do it all right, no one will notice, no one will ask me what's going on. And so those perfectionist tendencies can also be a manifestation. Hyperactivity, reactivity, quick shifts in mood or behavior, impulsiveness, these are all potential impacts of trauma on behavior. And I think one of this last bullet here, these rapid and unexpected sort of emotional shifts, again, can be very surprising to us as educators and can be very difficult to figure out how to manage. And so again, when we talked about before the creation of a trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive culture being about moving from being reactive to proactive, this is one area that I really think about, that our students may be shifting very quickly in their emotional states, but how do we as adults really stay proactive, right? And not just react to each one of those different states of being that the student might be encountering as they're navigating their day. One of the things we really like to stress, and you may do this in your work as well, is that these manifestations in behavior of the potential impacts of trauma, if we can keep in mind that what's driving that is the student trying to regain a sense of safety over their environment, that really the behavior is communicating, I'm feeling unsafe, right? And so how can we support the student to begin to experience that sense of safety again? In terms of trauma's impact on relationship, or the potential for there to be impacts on relationship, lack of trust is often one, right? Many young people who have experienced this kind of adversity, they don't get to have the experience of trusting relationships with adults and sometimes with young people. And so for educators, and I know for me in the school that I worked in, this often showed up by sort of that inconsistent relationship I might have with my students, where one day everything is going great, and then maybe even 2 days in a row, right? But then something, they might just come in the morning and something is very different. And so, just their ability to sort of have that sense of trust over time was impacted. And so we often had these sort of fits and starts in our relationship. And I mention that because for me as an educator, that was very difficult. I had to really learn to not take that personally. But this understanding of the impact of trauma really helped me to do that. And so it helped me really hang in there through those tougher moments. So lack of trust can manifest. Just also, we were talking earlier in the impacts on academics, just about some of the impacts on language. What can happen also is that because of that, there can be some real difficulty for young people to interpret verbal cues, nonverbal cues, facial gestures, sort of reading the room, reading how mood states are between adults and students and students and students. They're just that interpretation of what all of that means can be slightly off. And so that can really impact relationships. If I'm reading that you're always angry at me, but you're not, right? That can impact our relationship. And it can, young people can often also have just sort of a lack of insight in general into how to have a relationship, how to be in connection and in a positive relationship with their peers and with the adults who work with them. That ability to just take perspective can also be a struggle. And then even knowing their own emotional state, right, can be difficult. I've worked with many students who have sort of very limited vocabulary, right, when it comes around describing or identifying their emotions. It's sort of that happy or sad, happy or mad. And so, often in schools, we're working really hard to build skills in this area. And again, this is something that for individual students is important, but so important for all students, right? And so the more ways that we can embed in our school culture how to practice this, how to learn the skill and then practice it throughout the school day really helps sort of amplify the skill building for young people. Because, of the impacts on behavior that we were just talking about in the previous slide, this can really result in students having very unpredictable behavior, right? We talked about those rapid mood shifts. That unpredictability can also impact relationships, both with adults and with peers. And so when we think about these different potential impacts on relationships, again, understanding this gives us insight into what we might be able to do to support students through this. What can happen in schools often if educators don't have this sort of shared understanding of these impacts is that misunderstandings can occur between students and adults. And so what you see on the slide here are just a few examples of the kinds of misunderstandings that can take place. And if you take it a step further and think about, what might manifest based on that misunderstanding, we can again see why sort of building this shared understanding of the impact of trauma is so important. So for that student who, might be very vigilant, as we were talking about earlier, it's that perception that I'm in danger, right? I'm scanning for safety. It seems like, the world is a dangerous place. And the adult might interpret that as just a lack of paying attention or just not trying. For that student who has more sort of just let me fly under the radar, I'll do everything right. If I just try to, do things perfectly, right, I might be able to protect myself or protect anyone from knowing what's going on at home or in my community. And often as adults, we might think, oh, that's a great kid. They don't even need my help, right? They're so motivated. They're doing well. But we might be missing that holding all of that together could be sort of one of these manifestations. And so we may misunderstand what's happening for that student. For that student who might be, doing things in the classroom, that seem to be defiant or aggressive. I think of a young child I worked with who was a kindergartner who sometimes would get really dysregulated, right? And there was a lot of turning over chairs or sort of running around the room. It's just, again, sort of seeing that through the lens of the student's perspective of, I'm just trying to gain some control here, right? I feel maybe that my teacher is upset with me or that I didn't do my assignment right, and that feels dangerous. So let me just try to gain some control here. And so again, if we as adults only perceive that as the aggression and the defiance, we might attach labels then that can exacerbate the harm that they may be experiencing. And it can also set us down a path of intervention that isn't exactly the right path, right? What that student might need is not punishment for that behavior, right? But more, how do we help them build the skills to regulate their behavior and emotions? And then as we were talking about trust, just this idea that for some students, that ability to trust is, just that you even have my best interest at heart. I don't trust that, that my life experience hasn't shown me that could be true. And as educators, and I've heard this many times, right? It's just that sort of fatigue as we try to give and support a student and they sort of put the wall up. It becomes they just reject everything I try. And that can be taken really personally because we know so many educators who are really giving their time and attention and talent and trying really hard. And so again, building the understanding about what might be manifesting, what might be happening becomes so important as the educator can sort of hang in there through that and think about how to help that student build skill and build the ability to trust. And that takes time and it happens over time. So all of these misunderstandings that I've sort of described here are really about sort of individuals and adults. But we know that these kinds of misunderstandings can really lead to a systemic issue, a systemic problem, right? There can be instances where adults begin to sort of distance themselves from students, and that can really exacerbate harm that students have experienced in other parts of their life. They might misunderstand those kinds of traumatic symptoms or impacts as character flaws, just attaching judgment to them. They might misperceive students as being sort of unmotivated, lazy, defiant, those kinds of things. And most often in schools, that can really lead to sort of imposing or almost over-imposing punitive responses to that, to those impacts. And so, what I know in almost 30 years of doing this work, which is what I always say, you really cannot discipline the trauma response out of a student or in a punitive way, right? What the student needs is a focus on building skills, understanding themselves, creating their self-awareness, and they can be supported to do that at school. But the impacts on students, are grave and concerning, right? All of this can really send messages to young people that decrease their motivation and engagement at school. I've worked with so many young people who at some point may say to me something like, I just don't belong here. I can't get it right. Every day I mess up, right? It really decreases their motivation and their engagement in school and in learning. And of course, that can lead to poor grades, poor test scores, not completing school, strained or poor relationships with adults and with peers. And then, sort of translating as it goes on deeper and deeper, right? The sort of imposing of punitive responses, like Anne was describing, the student who was chronically suspended and eventually expelled. Or even, the information that we have about the school to prison pipeline, the students who are experiencing school as not a place for them, find other things which can sort of exacerbate the harm that they have encountered. And so all of this is to say, why do we need trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive school cultures? one thing I wanted to ask is, as you've worked with maybe adults in your buildings, what do you think can make it challenging for them to recognize behavior as a response to stress rather than just as misbehavior? What do you think is at play there? And I just invite you to share some examples in the chat if you would like to. Whoops, sorry about that. Mm. I think often it is sort of this general misunderstanding of what might be happening with the student. Um, So we've talked a lot about these impacts and the prevalence of traumatic experience. I wanted to just turn to how a trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive school begins to address this, because school is a place where we have the opportunity to really to address this, right? Our students are sent to us for several hours a day. And so one thing that's really important, as Anne mentioned in her opening comments, is just employing sort of this whole child lens or to promote student well-being and their success at school. Fostering connection and belonging becomes very important. Because that's not only critical for academic performance or academic success, it's also just a human need, right? That sense of connection and belonging. And then, of course, creating this kind of safe and supportive school culture. I wanted to just share with you sort of our definition of whole child. And I know you all have been with me for about an hour. So let me maybe get through this piece and then we'll take about a 10-minute break. So I wanted to share this with you as the way that we come to think about whole child. And there are many ways, and schools engage different ways of thinking whole child. But in this model, we talk about four domains, right? It's the student's sense of competence, all the different competencies, whether they're academic or sports or relationships or arts or music or dance or whatever the competencies are, right? We know our students' competencies. We take the time through relationship to get to know our students' competencies. We have a sense of our students' relationships, their ability to form and maintain relationships, both with peers and with the adults who work with them. We know a bit about self-regulation, right? This lens of, can the student regulate their emotions, behavior, attention? Because it's really the foundation for being successful at school. And then, of course, their physical, mental health, and well-being. So this whole child lens incorporates these four domains. And just to sort of illustrate, one of the ways that we think about this, I was just going to use an example of myself, maybe, which is, maybe on a day where my own physical health isn't so great, right? Maybe I have the scratchy throat or a low-grade fever or something like that. But I decide to try to push through. And I come to work and maybe I'm not, as competent as I might be on a day when I'm feeling great, right? Maybe I just think I'm going to get a couple of things done. I'm going to hang in through the day. I'm going to go to that meeting that I really need to make. But I'm probably not firing on all cylinders. So my competence may be, somebody from the outside might say, gosh, you only got one thing done today, right? It might be impacted. Maybe on my way to work, I engage in a conversation with my partner and say, you didn't make the coffee again, or maybe my relationship is impacted because I'm just not feeling that well. Maybe my sort of, my my ability to self-regulate is a little less than it usually is, or greatly impacted, right? Maybe my temper flares, or my energy is low, right? So it's really not that we see these domains in isolation, but it's that we think about the interactions between them. And so we use this when with our students in a trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive school to guide how we think about our students. As we get to know uh, these different areas about our students, it's sort of, Anne was saying earlier, quadruples the opportunity for connection, right? If I know something about what they're interested in, what they're competent in, or I know something about their relationships, or who they are, what they're into, right? I have this ability to connect in many different ways. And so this model of whole child can be very useful. We've seen schools take this model and really look at, for example, their student support methods, their student support system, and think about how the whole child lens is brought to that table. So if a student is being discussed, or a challenge or an issue is being discussed, how do we see that challenge or issue and gather data in each of these 4 domains to help inform how we respond to that challenge? So this is the model of whole child that we use. The other piece that the whole child kind of helps us think about, and there's so much academic research right now coming out about the importance of young people experiencing a sense of belonging and connection at school. That in safe and supportive trauma-sensitive schools, we foster a sense of belonging. And we do that because belonging is just a fundamental human need. It shapes a student's identity, their sense of self-worth, their self-esteem. It supports them to feel safe. And this goes beyond just connecting with people, right? It also includes spaces in the school, physical spaces especially. So fostering a sense of belonging and connection becomes core in creating trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive schools. I think what we will do now is take a bit of a break and come back and talk about the importance of student voice, and then actually see what a trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive school culture looks like in practice. So let's take about a 10-minute break, and I will see you back here in 10 minutes. Okay, everyone, welcome back. We're going to begin for the second half of this session, where we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into, sort of the creation of how you create these trauma-sensitive, safe and supportive school cultures. So I'm going to resume with looking here at the screen. Sorry, my Zoom. I'm unable to advance the slide. Give me 1 second. Technical difficulties midway through. That is never fun. Hold on 1 second. All right. Let's try that. Sorry about that. I'm going to just stop share and restart the slides. So I apologize for the disruption there. Okay. There we go. Hopefully that's working now. Okay. Let me go back just a few slides. We were going to have a break a little later, but I was running a little bit short on time. We were talking before the break just about the importance of a sense of belonging for young people, and especially in the context of a safe and supportive trauma-sensitive school. And I'm sure you all have come to, know more about this, especially recently with all of the academic research that's coming out Much of the research really demonstrates that when students have a voice in how their schools operate, schools actually improve. And I just wanted to share with you that we became aware of, one important study out of Chicago that asked the question, does student voice relate to academic outcomes? And what the researchers found is that when students have the opportunity to raise their voice in school-based decision making, and when adults listen, students' grades and attendance improved. And so I think what's really important, as I read this study, and I can share the information about the study, it's important, or what I noted and wanted to underscore is that it wasn't so much that the schools did everything that young people were asking for in this study, but rather what was important is that the students felt heard because it helped them feel respected, right? And really reinforce that sense of belonging. We know that when student voice is active in schools, from the research, that it can really create the conditions that support young people to feel empowered and connected. And in addition to that, it really helps us as the adults in the school make decisions and take actions that much better reflect the student's needs and lived experience. Here in Massachusetts, it's often that teachers in schools are vastly not reflective of the student population, right? Their lived experience is much different, and yet they're the adults making decisions about what's best for what's happening in that school, and so often those decisions really don't reflect the students' needs, and so they don't land, right? There's a mismatch, and so when we can find ways to bring student voice to the table, our decisions and actions just much better are much better aligned. The other thing that this does is it really can shift the power dynamics in the school when we sort of build in and incorporate ways for student voice to be centered and at the table. It shifts the power. And just sort of connecting that back to what we talked about in terms of our understanding of the impact of trauma is really important. Because we know that often those kinds of experiences, those adverse experiences, at the heart of them lies a sense of voicelessness, a sense of powerlessness. And so at school, when we can find ways to restore that, to bring the student into the decision, to ask them their opinion, ask them what's going on, hand them some agency over the situation, we're mitigating sort of the harmful impacts of trauma, but we're also helping the student build skills throughout their lifespan that will help do that. And all of this really does help support students' sense of belonging and agency. So I have a video here of a school, a very short clip, and hopefully in the Zoom world, it's going to play just fine. But this is an example of some work that a school who was engaged in the inquiry-based process that I'm getting ready to talk about. This was a challenge that they were facing, and this video clip shows you how they engaged student voice to address that challenge. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play.
Our African American students were upset that they couldn't wear headscarves in school.
Whereas I wear my scarf to school, and then like my type of hair is not immune to this weather. I shouldn't be having my hair like this sometimes, and I have to cover it.
When the girls and I started having real conversations about what it means for them to get ready in the morning and what it means to be able to wear a scarf on some days that they want to, I worked with them. We created a little committee, we looked at it, we took it to other administration, and they said, of course, this is what we do. This is why we listen to students.
I never seen a school that actually took time into learning about their students. That was the first time, but never compared to my elementary schools, I never really had that same relationship with teachers.
I think working with students to hear their voice on something that's really important, such as this topic, and then seeing that change through with them has made a huge impact on our relationships with students, and they feel valued and they feel heard.
So I just wanted to share, kind of a real-time example of this school's ability to kind of engage students in solving one of the issues that they were having. We could dissect this. This is a rich example, and we could dissect this in many different ways. But this example, I think, for me, what I focus on is the student. And the comment that she makes when she says, "I've never had a school ask me." And so I think that the positive steps that they took in terms of really engaging with the students to change their discipline policy, to change their rules and procedures that were misaligned with the population of students that they were serving, what was such a positive step. And again, and it goes back to sort of all the things, right? The trust building, the relationship building, the ability for the student to feel seen and heard in her school. And also that action impacted everyone in the school community. So I thought this was one example I really wanted to share in terms of how we think about these whole school kinds of examples. And so I just wanted to also maybe invite you to think a little bit about your schools and the school-wide activities or practices that you might have in place that support cultivating a sense of belonging among your students. What's already there? What already happens that really supports students to feel a part of their school community? And then as a second layer of reflection, as you think about that, are there groups of students in your school for whom those practices or activities might not be working? And this is where in this work, again, our eye is on all students. Oftentimes we are doing things in schools that work really well for some students, and we keep doing them because it works really well for some students. But we always want to have our eye on all students, and we want to have the space and the time to do the reflection, to gather the data that will tell us, are we really reaching all students? So just invite you to participate in that reflection at whatever level you feel comfortable. In addition to student voice, of course, if creating a trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive school is about building community, the other essential stakeholder in the community is family voice. So again, creating conditions that support families to feel empowered and connected to their students' success is at the core of the work of creating a safe and supportive school. This better helps, again, the decisions and the actions that the school is taking to reflect the lived experiences of the families that are a part of the school community. We know the academic research tells us that students do better when their families are involved. And so again, it reminds me of sitting with a group of high school students who shared with us, their thinking about this notion of family voice or family engagement at their school. And again, it wasn't that these teens wanted their family members, their caregivers and parents at knowing everything about what was going on with them in high school. But they did want to know that their families knew enough about what was going on at school with their academics, with their course of study, with how their school was run, that they could engage impactfully and meaningfully. And they cared a lot about that. This notion that, older students or adolescents don't want their families to be involved in their school was certainly debunked in that conversation. And mostly as schools can incorporate family voice in a meaningful way, it really communicates to families that the school honors and understands and respects the role of the parent or guardian or family as the child's first teacher. You know your child best, right? Help us, let's work together. Let's build this sense of community together. This is our school, and we're all working together to solve the urgency or the issues that may be at hand. So we've talked a little bit about prevalence and the impact of trauma. the whole child perspective and the how that sort of promotes a sense of belonging, the importance of that sense of belonging, and how student and family voice might play a role in also fostering that sense of belonging. I want to use the rest of the time that we have together to really present to you the what it looks like, feels like, and sounds like of a trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive environment. What you see on the slide here is sort of the definition or the trauma-sensitive vision, right? It's just a school where all students feel safe, welcomed, and supported, and empowered to really participate fully in all that the school community has to offer. And our schools do have so much to offer young people. It's often where young people get sparked, what their interest is, what their love is in terms of learning. And so we want to make sure that our young people have the ability to access all of that. It's also a school that takes the time to understand and develop that deep understanding of the impact of trauma, and that this understanding really drives our educational mission, that it's at the heart of what we do, that we bring the trauma lens, the trauma-sensitive lens, to all of our actions. So I want to share with you just a set of attributes. How do we get there? What are the attributes of trauma sensitivity? So the first one begins with just developing a shared understanding, much like we've done in the beginning part of this presentation, that all adults, or as many in the building as possible, right, leadership and staff, have this shared understanding of the impact of trauma on learning. That safety, once you understand sort of the impacts of trauma, you begin to understand why it's so important to support all students to feel safe, but not just physically safe, socially, emotionally, and academically safe as well. That the school works to address our students' needs in a holistic way. We talked about sort of bringing that whole child lens. That the school works to connect students to the school community, right? We're always asking that question: who is it working for? Who is it not? And how do we provide opportunities? We explicitly connect our students to our school community, and we provide these opportunities for our students to practice their developing skills across the day, across the building, across the adults and peers that they work with. So they're feeling connected. They're feeling that sense of belonging. That student voice is a part of our decision making. Those are sort of the attributes that are focused on students. The other really focus on adults, and there was a comment in the chat before the break that kind of mentioned, the struggle that it can be of holding sometimes all that educators are asked to hold when they're working with students. So these two attributes, I think, help support educators as well. The first one really talks about embracing teamwork and collaboration. And in the trauma-sensitive schools that we work in, this is just paramount. The educators are sharing practice. They're ignited and excited by the work that they're doing. It's a sense of a learning community. It's an ever-evolving set of work that they're engaged in. So the school across the board embraces teamwork, and staff share responsibility for all students, right? As a young educator, I remember being so focused on my own class and, just celebrating the days where it went well, right? If I asked them to line up after recess and they actually all did it and we made it back to the classroom, I was thrilled. But sometimes during that, I would pass a colleague maybe who had a student who was really struggling. And instead of sort of stopping to help, I might, to be honest with you, sort of think, oh, I'm really glad that's not me today, right? I wasn't embracing that sense of teamwork and shared responsibility for all students. And this trauma-sensitive lens really provides that we wouldn't pass someone who's struggling and not lend a hand, right? Or try to help problem solve. So embracing this sense of shared responsibility for all students. And then the last is really this focus on being able to anticipate and adapt to the ever-changing needs of students. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but for me, this underscores the importance of not building, a school culture or a system of policies and rules that guide our school that are so rigid that we can't be flexible to adapt to the needs of our students. That ability to adapt, to anticipate, helps us be much less in that reactive mode and to stay in the proactive mode. We're thinking through the challenges that might be coming and solving for those in a trauma-sensitive way. And we're thinking through how to set all of our students up for success. So those are the attributes. I wanted to share a quick video. I'm a little bit concerned about time. So I think what I might do is place the link to the video in the chat, along with this question of, thinking about the attributes and how you see those reflected in the video. This is a video of an elementary school who engaged in the inquiry-based process to create a trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive school culture, which I'm about to share with you. But I see the time, and it's a 10-minute video, so I'm worried that if I play the full 10 minutes, we may not have enough time for Q&A towards the end. So towards the end, I will share the link to the video with you all and just invite you to take a few minutes to watch it and to see how this process unfolded in this school. It's a large elementary school. Whoops. A large elementary school here in Massachusetts. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of engaging in inquiry and why using inquiry seems to be so paramount in creating trauma-sensitive, safe, and supportive schools. Using inquiry helps anyone in the school community sort of have this spirit of asking why. And when you ask why, it supports everyone, any stakeholder in the school, educators, parents, students, school leaders. Asking why really helps support them to engage in reflecting and questioning and talking about things, but also in generating ideas. And so when we build a school culture where inquiry is invited, we create opportunities for everybody to bring a question, right? We create an opportunity to communicate that everyone in the school community is valued for their questions and for their answers. So if you have ideas, share them. Let's engage in this sort of problem solving together. And again, it allows some of the power dynamics to be shaped in a different way, where it's a true sense of community that can be fostered. And in that way, can be shared ownership across students, families, educators, leaders. Often in our schools, just because of the way our system is set up, there's sometimes quite a hierarchy and quite a way that decisions sort of get mandated or sort of taken down the chain. This sort of turns that on its head and invites everyone in the school community to share ownership. So I want to share with you this inquiry-based process that TLPI has engaged in using with schools that is based on inquiry. It's an action planning process that just helps embed or integrate those values of trauma sensitivity, the attributes of trauma sensitivity into the school. And it begins with helping schools to sort of assess their readiness. How do we know we're ready to become trauma sensitive? And important for us to note, readiness isn't sort of static. It's not, yes, we're ready or no, we're not. But it's sort of like, what's in place that's going to support us to do this? And what might we need to put in place? So that might look like, doing some deep learning, right? Having some professional development or structuring some professional learning community conversations, or figuring out a way that we can sort of keep the learning community around trauma sensitivity growing over time. It might mean sort of taking a look at what's on the plate for the coming year. Schools often have so many initiatives that they're working on in a given year. And so do we have space? Do we have time for this? So assessing readiness is really important to sort of setting this up to be successful. The next sort of piece that we talk about is that the school staff together engage in identifying urgencies. What is feeling, urgent or important to us at the moment that we want to address in a more trauma-sensitive way? What might we need to do? What could this help us with? So identifying and getting very clear about that urgency, and then developing an action plan to address that urgency. And action planning can include, working with staff to think about what kinds of actions might address the urgency and move us closer to creating a more trauma-sensitive school. There might be mechanisms built in to have some family voice or student voice inform that action planning. But the idea is that the school, the staff in the school themselves get to sort of decide what are these actions we're going to be taking, and how are we going to decide whether or not they're creating the kind of impact that we hope that they will. So we are sort of, what's different to me about this, having worked in schools for many years, is it's not someone else sort of telling us what we have to do and how we have to do it to address a need. It's us sort of using our knowledge about the impact of trauma and our understanding of the attributes of trauma sensitivity to come up with trauma sensitive actions that will solve the issues that we're facing. So that involves, just as you saw in the attributes, sort of learning together as a whole staff, doing that learning until enough of a coalition is built that there's sort of an energy and a motivation to move, to really take on moving this work ahead in the school. It involves coming together as a team and sometimes asking really hard questions. I wanted to just share one example of some work that was done in the elementary school that is in the video that we didn't get to show tonight. But that school engaged in this process, and as a part of this process, they established a steering committee, a group of educators who were the ones who were sort of leading the work across the school. And so the steering committee consisted of educators, the school principal, the school counselor, the school nurse, just a broad base of representation from across the building. And as they were beginning the work, they were sort of identifying urgencies. And one of the things that they identified was that this had been a school that was two smaller schools, and the district decided to sort of merge it together to create one very large school. And so teachers would say, in the meeting, I think someone said something like, sometimes I pass people in the hallway and I don't even know who they are. I don't know if they work here or if they're a parent or a community member, And so they realized if we were really going to create a collaborative culture among the adults, where we were sharing, ideas and best practices and working together as a team, we have to make sure everyone connects as humans. We have to make sure everyone knows one another. And so they did a very simple action. So the identified urgency was around creating more connection among staff, building a cohesive staff. The action, one of the first actions, they took many, but one of the first actions they did was, just to put up a really big bulletin board in the hallway of the school that had a small photo of every single adult that worked in the building, along with their name, what their role was, and maybe a fun fact or two about them. And so what they quickly found was that not only was that impactful and helpful in helping the adults know one another, but it soon became quite a community builder. Students were standing before it saying, I didn't know Mrs. Jones spoke Japanese, and I didn't know, that she had a dog, right? Or whatever these common kind of connecting elements that the human elements were among the staff. And parents were as well. Parents were able to find out, who spoke the same language they did in the school. Maybe they hadn't been aware of that before. So this very simple action of putting up this bulletin board really had a large impact in terms of coming together as a cohesive staff and getting to know one another. One of the other actions they took in relation to that urgency was that they sort of changed the structure of their staff meetings. And prior to that work, they had really met mostly in grade level team meetings. So people on the third grade team knew each other really well. They worked really well together, but they never had, or they had very few opportunities to sort of get to know people in other grade levels or even to work with them. So they did much more sort of cross-level planning, vertical team planning. And that just also had a great impact on the students, right? The students were able over time, as they did that more consistently, they encounter that learning environment more consistently, right? So the practices that we do in first grade are building foundational skills, for example, with social emotional learning. Maybe it starts there. But by the time we're in fifth grade, developmentally, that's going to look very different. But all throughout my trajectory in this school, I've had this exposure to learning these skills and practicing them across the building. So, something that started out as touching just the adults in the building quickly translated to being really effective and positive for the students in the building as well. So action planning, but action planning that's very locally tailored to our urgencies, our needs. I want to just share with you sort of where this kind of process or trauma sensitive lens sort of gets us. And one of the first things that comes to mind as we think about this is just that it's the notion we've sort of been stressing all night that or all afternoon that doing or engaging in creating a trauma sensitive, safe and supportive school culture is really good for students impacted by trauma, but it's also really good for all students. And so in this way, as adults who are working in the building, we have this opportunity to sort of take this understanding of the impact of trauma, but also understand that as we design for those students who may be, more hypervigilant or aggressive or defiant or whatever those manifestations are that we talked about earlier, it's actually good for all kids. And so we don't have to think so hard about who gets what, or do I change the way I am in this situation versus that, right? We design for our students who we know may be impacted by trauma, and doing that is good for all students. And so we quickly see that this has an impact and becomes part of the school culture. It also is a really helpful tool for recognizing and repairing present and historical inequities. We talked a little bit about sort of the restoration of voice and agency as we work with young people in this way. And that becomes part of their school experience. It becomes part of their life experience. The trauma-sensitive lens also helps adults become allies across lines of difference. If we understand trauma, we understand sort of the impacts. I think it's very motivating often for educators and others to want to do something, right? To want to help. And so it really supports us to work across lines of difference, to seek understanding, to be curious about what might be going on, and to assume good intent, right? That it's not necessarily the manifestation of what I'm seeing, but maybe this person, whether it's a family or a student, maybe they're doing the very best that they can in this moment. And I can be curious about what I might be able to do to better support them. So we become allies across lines of difference. And then additionally, it really equips staff with tools. The attributes can be turned into questions. We call them the trauma-sensitive vision questions. And that helps us keep our eye on making sure that any action is actually trauma-sensitive, right? So I can take, for example, that attribute around ensuring that all students feel safe. And I can ask the question, if I'm going to take this action, if I'm going to ask the student to leave the classroom right now, is that going to help them feel safe physically, socially, emotionally, or academically? It's not to say that students don't sometimes need to leave the classroom. The answer to that question might be yes in the moment, right? But it also helps keep our eye on how do we reconnect them to our classroom community? How are they welcomed back? And how do we make sure they know they're caught up and ready to go as they re-enter the classroom? So those questions can really, they become tools. And as we've worked with schools educators become very facile with those questions as a tool. Sometimes they'll have them printed out next to them as they're doing work, and other times it just becomes part of the way they do things. And that really does create a more responsive and equitable school community. The other thing that using this trauma-sensitive lens creates is a number of shifts, critical shifts in the ways that educators are thinking and practicing. So in the traditional lens, often we've spoken about this today. There can be we're sort of stuck in this mode of just reacting often to students' needs. But the trauma-sensitive lens allows us to become much more proactive. We're thinking ahead. We're setting things up so that students succeed. In the traditional lens, often we are focused on sort of solving student by student, individual supports, really high focus on the individual student. And the trauma-sensitive lens holds both. It's focusing on the individual student support. Of course, that's critical, but it's also how does our school-wide culture, our school-wide practice support the student? So it's that the student then can experience the school day in a way that doesn't have them on that sort of roller coaster of being triggered. Often in the traditional lens at school, we're managing behavior mostly through punitive discipline. There's an infraction, a student receives a consequence. And so what we know when we think about our knowledge about the impact of trauma is that often that punitive discipline can have the very unintended consequence of disconnecting the student further from the school community. And so in a trauma-sensitive school, the focus becomes on skill building and self-regulation, fostering relational accountability, having the focus be on, how we repair harms when they exist. We've seen a school sort of take their whole discipline system and shift toward building in different ways that the relational accountability is attended to at every step of the way. And so if there's an infraction or a breaking of the rule in the classroom and the student is asked to leave the classroom for that reason, the adult that they then go meet with is able to have a conversation with them, help them name what was happening, sort of help process it. But the student doesn't go back to the classroom until there's a meeting between the student and the teacher. So you just think about that in practice. That requires a lot of elements, right? But so important to mend that relationship between student and teacher so that both can start with a clean slate and both can sort of tend to whatever harms might have happened and think about, the relationship as core and center. There's a lot of work being done in schools now around this. The other thing that this trauma-sensitive lens can help shift is, not that we let go of the academic focus. Academics are very important, but more recently, academics have become sort of hyper-focused, hyper-centered. And so this lens, again, allows us to sort of keep that whole child focus where we see the entirety of the student's experience and are informed by that. And it also helps us shift out of the current state of sort of siloed and sort of solo efforts to address needs or just very different ways to address needs in different pockets of students to staff really working together in collaboration. We're going to get to a Q&A here in just a second, but I wanted to just sort of finish up with sharing with you a little bit about what the research says about the impact of this inquiry-based process. We had the fortunate experience of engaging in a demonstration schools project and worked with several schools who engaged in this process of inquiry of identifying urgencies and doing trauma-sensitive action planning. And so what you see on the slide here are just some of the outcomes that we found after the researchers found after about 2 years of engaging in this process, which is that the inquiry-based process is effective at empowering teachers and sort of democratizing educator voice, and it helped educators sort of build this sense of shared ownership for the school climate and culture change. And it did produce shifts in mindset that led to shifts in practice over time. And so what you see there bolded are sort of the core outcomes that are focused on staff, that improved staff cohesion and communication and empowered educators. And we had the fortune of continuing into a third year. And what you see here are a few of the research outcomes from that report. One that's so important to us is that engaging in this process, the researchers found, really does affirm cultural identity and promotes a sense of belonging among young people in these schools, and re-envisions discipline toward relational accountability. So this process is effective at supporting this to happen. So I've been talking for a long time, and I want to give this sort of last question to you, and then open up for a few minutes of Q&A before we end our time. But just thinking about today's discussion, what's beginning to feel urgent for you to address in your school in light of sort of this knowledge about the impact of trauma? So for you to apply the trauma-sensitive lens in your setting, what might be feeling urgent? And how would becoming more trauma sensitive help address that urgency? Just a little bit of time for you to sort of reflect on that. And you can feel free to put in the chat or just to have the reflection yourself. We have about 5 minutes left of our time, so I want to just open it up to Q&A.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Marissa,
go ahead.
so much
Sure.
for everything that you shared. Wow, so much information just came through. And we have I guess well, wait, I see if any additional ones come up in the question. And this might be
Yeah.
a more difficult question, but as you were talking about trauma and trauma and trauma, one thing that was just really here in the Bay Area, in Oakland particularly, we've had some pretty high profile shootings in our school.
Yes.
Right now. And there's that when I think when my students are placed there and working and training there, the community violence, since like this sense of like how to be safe in a school becomes such a challenge. And so I was curious if you have any thoughts or things that maybe practical stuff that school counselors can do, or think what comes to mind when you think about what do we do when there's incidents like that happening in our school?
Yeah, that's a really, well, it's a great question, but it's a difficult one, right? And so, I think one of the things may be just thinking about how this lens can be applied. Often, what we've seen in the work that we've done with schools is that often the work sort of starts with the adults themselves. And so can the school community, the adults in the building, sort of come together and get on the same page and sort of think about how to begin to establish safety with one another before they think about, how to extend that to the students. And so has there been time and space for the adults working in that building to reestablish their own sense of safety? What would that even look like? How has the community sort of what kind of community supports are in place, those kinds of things. But we often find that there's sort of like this need for adults to sort of in the building to sort of get on the same page first, and sort of help hold one another. And then it becomes part of sort of extending, the natural next step is to figure out how to extend that to the students in the building and then the community. And so we've seen, this process unfold over time. In this way, where it sort of ends up where there are even, community stakeholders coming together at the table over, a series of meetings over months and months to try to address urgencies like you're describing. And so also my heartfelt sort of sentiments to the community for that. That's a very difficult situation.
For sure. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's super helpful. I'm just looking to see if I have more questions coming
Yeah.
in. Um, uh, do you have any examples you can point to of schools that you feel like are doing this well, like places where our participants here could go to find more information about, some model schools that are addressing as well.
Absolutely. I think I would mostly invite you to come to our website or contact
Okay.
me, and happy to sort of learn more about sort of what the needs are or what level that you would be thinking of. There are a number of schools engaged meaningfully in this work, and we have worked with some really amazing principals who are very willing to share, their experiences and expertise.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm thinking about that coming together and the principals leading, and then also just thinking about in our context, in our news today, we're so far away from contract agreements between
Yes.
educators, and I think there was just a vote to strike, which
Yes.
understandable. So I think,
Yes.
yeah, it's all of these things, all of these disconnects that are happening at the adult level are kind of reflecting down to kids and coming up, and so
That's
yeah,
right.
it seems like bringing everyone together, having more of us getting on the same page, that seems so important.
Yeah, and how we structure. I mean, I think such a big part of this is, what's the infrastructure we can build to do that in a meaningful way?
Yeah,
How do we bring people together to talk about things and let, this work often involves really grappling with some hard things. And so
yeah,
where's the space to do that and to do that in a way where we're sort of focused on solving, and working
sure.
together to solve?
Yeah, yeah, in the face of financial cuts and,
That's
and like
right.
more
That's
and more
right.
demands on educators and counselors' time and all that. So
That's
yeah, so I
right.
see
That's
that.
right.
Well, I do see it is the top of the hour. It's time for us to let you go. Thank you again. Reminder to everyone, fill out your evaluation forms if you want a certificate for this attendance today. Thank you again, Marissa, so much for sharing
Thank
all of this with
you.
us. Really appreciate it. And we'll post this video so that this knowledge gets out there further. Have a
Really
great
appreciate it.
evening. and,
Thanks to all of you for hanging in here for 2 hours. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Take good care.
As well. Thank you.